The rain came down in unrelenting sheets, hammering against the roof of Liam's car as he sat parked outside the Hillcrest Hotel. The rhythmic drumming on the windshield did little to calm the storm raging inside him. He stared at the hotel's glowing sign, its golden letters mocking him with their warmth. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Liam didn't want to believe the text he'd received an hour ago. He didn't recognize the number, but the words had been clear. She's with him. Room 214. You deserve to know the truth. For weeks, his gut had been telling him something was off. Emma had become distant, her laughter hollow, her touch fleeting. She'd started working late more often, avoiding his questions with vague excuses. He had wanted to trust her. He had wanted to believe that their marriage, though not perfect, was still strong. But now, with the weight of suspicion crushing him, he knew he couldn't ignore the signs anymore. He reached for the door handle, his movements slow and deliberate. The rain immediately drenched him as he stepped out of the car, his coat doing little to shield him. Each step toward the hotel felt heavier than the last, like wading through quicksand. He hesitated at the entrance, the warmth of the lobby contrasting sharply with the chill of the night. A doorman glanced at him but didn't say a word as Liam made his way inside. The lobby was quiet, save for the soft hum of music playing overhead. The scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. Liam ignored the curious gaze of the concierge as he walked toward the elevators. His shoes squelched against the marble floor, leaving a faint trail of water in his wake. The ride to the second floor felt like it lasted an eternity. The ding of the elevator arriving at his destination made him jump slightly, his nerves frayed. He stepped into the hallway, his heart pounding louder with each step he took toward room 214. The burgundy carpet muffled his footsteps, but he could hear the faint sound of laughter ahead, Emma's laughter. It was a sound he hadn't heard in months, a sound he once cherished but now felt like a dagger to his chest. He stopped in front of the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light escape. His breath hitched as he reached out, pushing it open a fraction more. The sight before him made his world crumble. There she was, lying in bed with another man. Her head rested on his chest, her smile radiant as she looked up at him. The man said something Liam couldn't hear, and Emma laughed, her hand playfully swatting his arm. The intimacy of the moment made Liam's stomach churn. This wasn't just a fling. This was something deeper, something that had no place in the life they'd built together. Liam's mind raced. Every late-night excuse, every phone call she'd taken in another room, every moment she'd pulled away from him, it all made sense now. His chest tightened, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the carpet. The noise was soft, but it was enough to catch Emma's attention. Her head turned toward the door, her laughter dying instantly. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Emma's face went pale, her expression shifting from shock to guilt in an instant. She scrambled to pull the sheet up around her, as if it would erase what he'd just seen. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man beside her sat up, his expression annoyed rather than ashamed. "Who's this?" he asked, his tone casual, as if Liam were some unimportant intruder. Liam stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. The air felt thick, every breath a struggle. His gaze shifted from Emma to the man, then back to Emma. He didn't know where to start. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief, it all bubbled to the surface at once. "How long?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Emma swallowed hard, her hands clutching the sheet tightly. "Liam, it's not what it looks like," she began, her voice shaky. "Not what it looks like?" he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I saw you, Emma. I heard you. Don't stand there and insult me by pretending this isn't exactly what it looks like." Tears filled her eyes, spilling over as she tried to speak. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Find out what?" Liam snapped. "That my wife, the woman I've spent the last 7 years of my life with, is in bed with another man? That everything we've built together means nothing to you?" Emma flinched, her tears falling faster now. "It's not like that, Liam," she said, her voice breaking. "I Things between us haven't been the same for a long time. I didn't know how to fix it. So you decided to destroy it instead? He asked, his voice rising. You could have talked to me, Emma. You could have told me what was wrong. But no, you chose this. The man, clearly uncomfortable, stood and began gathering his clothes. I think I'll give you two some space, he muttered, slipping into the bathroom to dress. Neither Liam nor Emma paid him any attention. Liam took a shaky breath, his fists clenched at his sides. Do you love him? He asked, his voice quieter now. Emma hesitated, her silence answering the question more clearly than words ever could. Liam felt his chest tighten, the pain almost unbearable. He turned toward the door, his hand resting on the knob. Don't follow me, he said, his voice barely audible. I need time. And so do you. Liam, please, Emma called after him, her voice desperate. But he didn't stop. He walked out of the room, out of the hotel and into the storm. The rain soaked him to the skin, but he didn't care. It was easier to focus on the cold than the ache in his chest. He wandered the streets, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion, they all swirled together, leaving him exhausted. He had no destination in mind, no plan for what came next. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The rain had stopped by the time Liam reached the house, but the cold lingered, seeping into his bones. His clothes clung to his skin, damp and uncomfortable, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by Emma, her face, her laugh, the way she'd rested her head on that man's chest like it was her home. It played on a loop in his mind, each repetition twisting the knife deeper. He stood on the porch, staring at the door he had walked through countless times. It had always been a place of comfort, a refuge. Tonight, it felt like a threshold he wasn't sure he could cross. His hand hovered over the doorknob as he tried to steady his breathing. Finally, he pushed the door open. The house was eerily quiet. The faint scent of vanilla lingered in the air, a reminder of Emma's favorite candles. The living room lamp cast a soft glow, illuminating the room in warm tones. Liam's eyes immediately fell on Emma sitting on the couch. She was curled up, her head in her hands. When she heard the door close, she looked up, her face streaked with tears. Liam, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it for support. For a moment he just stood there taking her in. This was the woman he had loved for years, the woman he had shared his dreams and fears with. But tonight she felt like a stranger. How long? He asked, his voice trembling. Emma wiped at her face, her hands shaking. Liam, Don't lie to me, he interrupted, his tone sharper than he intended. I need to know. How long has this been going on? Her lip quivered as she hesitated. Finally she looked away and said, 6 months? The words hit him like a physical blow. 6 months. Half a year of lies and deceit. He took a step forward, his legs unsteady. 6 months, he repeated, his voice low. 6 months of coming home to me, of smiling in my face while you were with him? Liam, she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. Do you have any idea what you've done? He asked, his voice rising. Do you have any idea what it felt like to see you with him? To see you laugh like that? Emma broke down, sobs racking her body. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said through her tears. It just happened. I didn't know how to stop it. You didn't know how to stop it, Liam said, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You knew how to sneak around. You knew how to lie to my face. But stopping was too hard. Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I was lonely, Liam, she said, her voice barely audible. You were always working late, always distracted. I felt like I didn't matter anymore. His anger flared. So this is my fault? He snapped. I was working late for us, Emma. To build a life for us. And this is how you repay me? I'm not blaming you, she said quickly. I felt lost. And then he was there and you thought that was the solution? Liam interrupted. To throw away everything we've built? To destroy everything we had? She sobbed harder, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I hurt you. I hate myself for it. Liam stared at her, his chest heaving. He wanted to yell, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused him. But instead, he sank into the armchair across from her, his hands gripping the armrests. "I trusted you," he said quietly. "For 7 years I trusted you with everything I had. And you broke that. You broke us." Emma buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. "I never stopped loving you," she said, her words barely audible. "I need you to know that." "Don't," Liam said, his voice sharp. "Don't you dare say you love me. Love doesn't do this. Love doesn't destroy the person it's supposed to protect." The room fell into silence, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Liam leaned back in the chair, exhaustion washing over him. He closed his eyes, memories of their life together flashing through his mind. Their wedding day, her smile brighter than the sun. Lazy Sunday mornings spent tangled in each other's arms. The way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes. It all felt like it belonged to another lifetime. "I need proof," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Emma looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion. "Proof?" she echoed. "Proof that this is over," he said. "Proof that you're done with him. Phone records, emails, whatever it takes. I need to know there's nothing left between you." Emma hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "I'll give you whatever you need." Liam stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. "I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight," he said. "I can't be here right now." "Liam, please," Emma said, standing as well. "Don't leave. Let's talk this through." He shook his head. "I can't, Emma. Not tonight." Without another word, he walked to the door. His hand lingered on the knob for a moment before he opened it. "I'll be back for my things," he said quietly. I can't do this right now." "Liam," Emma called after him, her voice desperate. But he didn't turn around. He stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting him like a slap. The streets were quiet as he walked, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He had no destination in mind, no plan for what came next. All he knew was that the life he had known was over. Liam sat on the edge of the bed in his small, dimly lit hotel room. The hum of the air conditioner buzzed faintly in the background, blending with the distant sounds of the city outside. The light from his phone illuminated his face, casting sharp shadows under his eyes. Sleep had become an impossible luxury. His mind wouldn't let him rest, not when every time he closed his eyes, the image of Emma's laughter with another man came flooding back. He stared at his phone for what felt like an eternity, the black screen taunting him. What do I do now? The question had no easy answer. He unlocked the phone, his fingers hovering over their shared phone account app. 4 years, Liam had never even thought to check her call history, let alone snoop through her texts. The idea of mistrusting Emma had been unimaginable. But that world, the one where their love had been enough, was gone. He clicked into the account, a wave of guilt washing over him. Was this crossing a line? Did he really want to know the truth, or was ignorance better? He shook the thought from his head. You already know the truth, he told himself. Now you need proof. As the screen loaded, rows of phone numbers appeared. Most were ones he recognized, family, friends, co-workers. But one stood out. A number he didn't know, repeated over and over again. Liam tapped on it, his heart pounding as the list expanded to show timestamps. There were calls at odd hours, late at night when he was working late, during her supposed yoga classes, even on weekends when she'd claimed to be catching up with friends. His stomach churned. He scrolled further, the timeline confirming what he already suspected. This wasn't new. It had been going on for months, right under his nose. The realization felt like a sucker punch. He grabbed the edge of the bed for support, his breath shallow. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to see it laid out so clearly. Liam sat back against the headboard, his phone resting on his lap. His mind raced with questions. Who is he? What does he have that I don't? Why wasn't I enough? He knew the questions wouldn't lead to answers, but he couldn't stop himself from asking them. He shook his head and refocused on the task at hand. This wasn't about his feelings anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. Switching over to her messages, Liam scrolled through Emma's conversations. Most of them were benign, filled with the casual chatter of everyday life. But something caught his attention, a hidden folder he hadn't noticed before. His fingers hovered over it. He hesitated. Do you really want to do this? Yes. He clicked it open. The first message hit him like a truck. Last night was perfect. I can't wait to see you again. The next was worse. You're the only one who makes me feel alive. Liam's hands began to tremble as he read through them. There were dozens, each one more damning than the last. Emma had poured her heart into these messages, sharing thoughts and feelings she hadn't expressed to him in years. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. He couldn't stop scrolling even though every word was like a knife twisting in his gut. Finally he couldn't take it anymore. He threw the phone onto the bed and buried his face in his hands. The betrayal was deeper than he'd imagined. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a second life she'd been living, completely separate from him. And yet he couldn't walk away. Not yet. He needed more. The next morning, Liam sat in a cafe, nursing a coffee that had gone cold. Across from him sat Mason, an old friend from college who had made a career out of private investigations. Mason was one of the few people Liam trusted to handle the situation. He leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning Liam's face. This is heavy, man, Mason said, breaking the silence. Are you sure about this? Once I start digging, there's no turning back. Liam nodded. I have to know everything. If there's more she's hiding, I need to find it. Mason sighed, pulling out a small notebook. Okay, tell me what you've got so far. Liam recounted everything, the calls, the texts, the hotel room. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him, shaking slightly as he gestured. Mason listened intently, jotting down notes without interruption. When Liam finished, Mason tapped his pen against the table. This isn't just about the affair, is it? He asked. Liam hesitated. It's about knowing the truth. I don't know who she is anymore, Mason. I don't know what's real and what's a lie. Mason nodded. I'll see what I can find. But brace yourself, Liam. If there's more to this, it might be worse than you think. Over the next week, Mason sent Liam a steady stream of updates. Each one peeled back another layer of the life Emma had been hiding. She had been meeting her lover regularly, often while Liam was out of town. But there was more. Financial records Mason uncovered revealed discrepancies in their shared accounts. Emma had been withdrawing large sums of money, transferring them to an account Liam didn't recognize. Liam sat in his car outside the bank Mason had identified. He stared at the building, his mind racing. Inside, the bank manager was polite but firm, refusing to give him any information without Emma's authorization. I'm sorry, Mr. Hale, she said. I wish I could help, but privacy laws are strict. Walking back to his car, Liam clenched his fists. The evidence was mounting, but it wasn't enough. He needed to know where the money was going. The breakthrough came 2 days later. Mason called, his tone serious. The account she's been transferring money to isn't hers, he said. It's under his name. Her lover. Liam's blood ran cold. Why would she? He couldn't finish the question. I don't know yet, Mason said. But I'm close. There's something about this guy you need to know. The next call confirmed Liam's worst fears. Emma's lover wasn't just someone she had fallen for. He was a professional con artist. Mason had uncovered a string of women he had seduced and stolen from, leaving them financially ruined. Emma was just his latest target. Liam sat in silence as Mason laid out the details. She doesn't even know who he really is, Mason said. She thinks he loves her. She's been lying to me, Liam said, his voice hollow. But she doesn't deserve this. No, she doesn't, Mason agreed. So what are you going to do? Liam stared at the pile of evidence Mason had sent over. His anger burned hot, not just at Emma, but at the man who had manipulated her. I'm going to make sure he pays, he said quietly. Liam sat at a corner table in a small, dimly lit diner. The smell of coffee and fried bacon filled the air, but he barely noticed. He stared at the black coffee in front of him, untouched and slowly cooling. The events of the past week weighed heavily on him. Emma's betrayal, the discovery of her lover's true identity, the financial secrets that had unraveled everything he thought he knew about his life. He was drowning in a sea of questions with no clear answers. The jingling of the bell above the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mason stepped in, his leather jacket dripping with rain. He spotted Liam instantly and made his way over, a file folder tucked under his arm. Mason dropped into the seat across from Liam with a sigh, setting the folder on the table between them. "You look like hell," Mason said, raising an eyebrow. "Feel worse," Liam replied flatly, finally wrapping his hands around the coffee mug for warmth. "What did you find?" Mason leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Before we get into that, how are you holding up?" Liam's jaw tightened. "How do you think?" Mason nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Look, I've seen cases like this before. I know it feels like the end of the world right now, but you're not alone in this." He leaned forward, his voice firm. "We're going to figure this out. If they think they can get away with this, they've got another thing coming." Liam let out a shaky breath. It wasn't much, but Mason's words gave him a sliver of hope, something he hadn't felt in days. Mason opened the folder and slid a few documents across the table. "Here's what I've got so far. Your wife's lover, Daniel Cross, if that's even his real name, has a track record. He's been conning women for years. From what I can tell, he targets women who are emotionally vulnerable and financially stable. He earns their trust, gets them to funnel money into accounts he controls, and then he disappears." Liam stared at the documents, his stomach churning as he took in the details. There were photos of Daniel with other women, bank statements showing suspicious transactions, and even an arrest record from years ago. "Does she know any of this?" Liam asked, his voice low. Mason shook his head. "Not likely. Guys like him are masters at manipulating people. He's probably painted himself as the perfect guy, everything she thinks she's missing. By the time she finds out the truth, it's too late." Liam clenched his fists. "I can't believe she fell for this. I can't believe I didn't see it." "You're not the first and you won't be the last," Mason said. "But the question now is, what are you going to do about it?" Liam stared at the photos, his mind racing. "I want to stop him," he said finally. "Not just for me, for her too. She might have betrayed me, but she doesn't deserve to have her life ruined by someone like him." Mason nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's the Liam I know. Always looking out for everyone else, even when they don't deserve it." Liam ignored the comment. "What's our next move?" Over the next few days, Mason and Liam worked tirelessly. Mason used his network of contacts to dig deeper into Daniel's past, uncovering more evidence of his schemes. Meanwhile, Liam began to take a more active role in the investigation. It gave him a sense of purpose, a way to channel his anger and pain into something productive. Late one night, Liam sat in his hotel room, poring over the documents Mason had given him. His eyes were bloodshot and his head ached, but he refused to stop. Each piece of evidence felt like another step closer to exposing the truth. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it for every woman Daniel had ever conned, and every person who had ever been betrayed. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Mason standing there with a laptop under his arm. "I've got something you're going to want to see," Mason said, walking past him into the room. "What is it?" Liam asked, closing the door. Mason set the laptop on the desk and pulled up a video. "It's from a security camera at the hotel where you caught them. Watch." The footage was grainy but clear enough. It showed Emma and Daniel walking into the hotel lobby together, laughing and holding hands. They didn't look like people hiding an affair. They looked like a couple in love. Liam's stomach turned as he watched them check in at the front desk, completely oblivious to the world around them. But then something caught his attention. Daniel's hand lingered on Emma's bag for just a second too long. He pulled something out and slipped it into his pocket. "Did you see that?" Mason asked, pausing the video. Liam nodded, his jaw tightening. "What did he take?" "Still working on that," Mason said. "But it's clear he's not just using her for money. He's got some other angle. We just need to figure out what it is." As the investigation continued, Liam began to feel a shift. The hopelessness that had consumed him after discovering the affair was slowly giving way to something else: determination. He wasn't going to let Daniel get away with this. And he wasn't going to let Emma fall any deeper into his trap. One afternoon, Mason called with another update. "I found something interesting," he said. Daniel's been using a fake name and identity, but I managed to track down his real one. His name is Mark Daniels and he's wanted in 3 states for fraud and identity theft. There's a warrant out for his arrest. Liam felt a surge of satisfaction. So we can turn him in? Not yet, Mason said. We need more. The authorities aren't going to act on this without solid evidence tying him to his latest scam. That's where you come in. Me? Liam asked, frowning. You know him better than anyone at this point, Mason said. You've seen how he operates. If we can get him to slip up, we might have enough to take him down. Liam hesitated. The thought of confronting Daniel made his blood boil, but he knew Mason was right. What do you need me to do? Mason smiled. We'll set a trap. The planning began in earnest. Mason laid out a strategy to lure Daniel into revealing his true intentions. It involved careful coordination, a bit of acting on Liam's part and a whole lot of patience. Liam wasn't sure he was up to the task, but Mason's confidence was infectious. You've got this, Mason said one evening as they reviewed the plan. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone in this. Liam nodded, a small spark of hope flickering to life. For the first time in weeks he felt like he was regaining control. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Daniel, or anyone else, define it for him. Liam sat in the dim light of his hotel room, staring at the scattered documents Mason had left behind. The hum of the air conditioner droned on, but his mind was focused on a single goal, taking Daniel Cross or Mark Daniels down. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough. Liam needed a plan that would leave no room for escape, no opportunity for Daniel to wiggle out of the consequences. On the table before him were bank statements showing Emma's transfers to Daniel, photos of Daniel with other women he had conned, and the arrest warrant Mason had uncovered. Liam leaned forward, his fingers tracing the edges of a grainy photo of Daniel smiling arm in arm with a woman outside a luxury car dealership. It was the same smile Liam had seen in the security footage, charming, confident, and utterly deceitful. They've underestimated me, Liam muttered to himself, a bitter smile curling his lips. He leaned back in his chair, his determination solidifying. Daniel thought he was untouchable. Emma thought she could keep Liam in the dark. They were both wrong. The next day, Mason joined Liam in his hotel room. The table was now neatly organized, the chaos of the night before replaced with a sense of purpose. Mason set down a fresh cup of coffee and took a seat across from Liam. You've been busy, Mason said, glancing at the arranged evidence. Had to be, Liam replied, his voice steady. We don't have time to waste. Mason grinned. That's the spirit. So what's the plan? Liam leaned forward, tapping the edge of a financial report. We use this, the money Emma's been funneling to Daniel. It's the easiest thread to pull. If we can get proof that he's using it for fraud, we'll have him. Mason nodded, his expression serious. And Emma? Are you going to confront her again? Liam hesitated. The thought of facing her, of hearing her excuses, made his stomach churn. Not yet, he said finally. I need to know everything before I do. If she's complicit in this, I don't even want to think about it. Mason placed a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder. We'll get to the bottom of it. You're not alone in this. Over the following week, Liam and Mason put their plan into motion. Mason contacted a forensic accountant he knew, a sharp-witted woman named Rachel who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. When Rachel arrived at the hotel room, she wasted no time diving into the documents. This guy's sloppy, she said after an hour of reviewing the files. He's good at hiding the money but not good enough. These transfers Emma made? They're all going to shell accounts tied to him. Liam frowned. Shell accounts? Fake companies, Rachel explained. He probably set them up to make it look like the money is going to legitimate businesses. But they're all linked back to the same IP address. Mason smirked. Classic con artist move. Thinks he's smarter than everyone else. Rachel glanced up from the papers, her sharp eyes meeting Liam's. This is solid evidence, but we'll need more if we want to make it stick. We need him on record admitting to the scam, or better yet, actively trying to pull off another one. Liam's stomach sank. The thought of confronting Daniel directly made his blood boil, but he knew Rachel was right. How do we do that? Mason leaned back in his chair, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. We set him up. The next step in the plan was to create a scenario where Daniel would reveal his true intentions. Mason suggested they bait him with an opportunity he couldn't resist, access to a large sum of money. Liam was hesitant at first, but the idea was sound. Daniel's greed would be his downfall. Rachel helped fabricate a financial profile for a fictional wealthy investor, complete with fake bank statements and a carefully crafted backstory. Mason used his connections to plant the rumor that the investor, posing as a friend of Liam, was looking for a business partner for a lucrative deal. "It's risky," Liam said as they reviewed the plan. "What if he doesn't take the bait?" "He will," Mason said confidently. "Guys like him can't resist easy money. And once he bites, we've got him." The trap was set. Mason arranged for a meeting between Daniel and the fictional investor, using a rented office space to make it look legitimate. Liam insisted on being there, watching the interaction from a hidden camera feed in an adjoining room. When Daniel arrived, he was dressed to impress, a tailored suit, polished shoes, and that same charming smile Liam had come to despise. He shook hands with the investor, his demeanor confident and smooth. Liam clenched his fists as he watched Daniel weave his web of lies. He pitched grand ideas, claiming to have insider knowledge and connections that would guarantee success. The investor played along, asking questions designed to draw out more details. "Of course, we'd need a small investment up front," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. Just to get things started." "How small?" the investor asked, feigning interest. Daniel smiled. 50,000 should be enough. Once we're up and running, you'll see returns within a month." Liam's blood boiled. This was the same line Daniel had likely used on Emma, the same lie that had convinced her to funnel their money into his schemes. He wanted to burst into the room and confront him right then, but Mason placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Not yet," Mason whispered. "Let him hang himself first." After the meeting, Mason and Rachel worked quickly to compile the evidence. The recording of Daniel's conversation, combined with the financial records, painted a clear picture of his deception. They sent everything to the authorities, ensuring it was airtight. The following day, Liam sat with Mason and Rachel in the hotel room, reviewing the final report. The sense of accomplishment was bittersweet. Exposing Daniel would bring justice, but it wouldn't erase the pain of Emma's betrayal. "You did good," Mason said, clapping him on the back. "This guy's going down because of you?" Liam nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's not just about me. It's about making sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Rachel stood, gathering her things. "The authorities should have everything they need. Now it's just a waiting game." That night, Liam sat alone in his room, staring out the window at the city lights. The plan was in motion, and for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of control. Daniel had underestimated him, but Liam wasn't the same man he had been before. He had faced betrayal, pain, and uncertainty, but he had come out stronger. As he watched the lights flicker in the distance, he allowed himself a moment of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it head-on. Liam sat in his rented office space, the glow of his laptop screen reflecting in his tired eyes. It was late, but he couldn't rest. The final pieces of his plan were falling into place. He and Mason had gathered all the evidence they needed to expose Daniel's con, and now it was time to make it public. They had spent weeks carefully plotting each move, and tonight was the night to start. Emails drafted with precision sat in his outbox, ready to be sent to key figures in Daniel's life. Former victims, Emma's colleagues, and even a few of Daniel's unsuspecting connections would soon receive the evidence. Each email contained screenshots of transactions, snippets of conversations, and copies of the fake financial documents Daniel had used to lure his victims. Liam hovered over the send button, his finger trembling. A part of him hesitated, not out of guilt but out of fear. This was the moment of no return. Once he hit send, there would be no undoing the fallout. "You've got this," Mason said from across the room, sensing Liam's hesitation. "This is what we've been working for." Liam nodded, his jaw tightening. They deserve to know the truth. With one final breath, he clicked send. The emails shot into cyberspace, the first domino in a chain that would dismantle Daniel's life. The fallout was immediate. The next morning, Liam's phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications. Mason sat beside him, sipping his coffee as they scrolled through the chaos together. The recipients of the emails had wasted no time sharing the revelations. Social media was ablaze with posts and comments about Daniel's deceit, his past crimes, and his current schemes. Hashtags like #DanielExposed and #ConArtistUnveiled began trending locally. One email, sent to the company where Daniel claimed to be a consultant, hit harder than they had anticipated. By midday, Liam received a forwarded message from one of the company's employees. It was a copy of an internal memo. Daniel's contract had been terminated, effective immediately, pending further investigation. Attached to the memo was a screenshot of the email Liam had sent, with his name redacted. "Looks like they're cleaning house," Mason said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied grin. Liam didn't respond. He was too focused on the next part of the plan. The exposure wasn't just about ruining Daniel's reputation, it was about making him desperate. A desperate man made mistakes, and Liam needed Daniel to slip up. By afternoon, the pressure was beginning to show. Daniel stormed into the office of one of his few remaining associates, his usual confident demeanor replaced by barely contained rage. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, slamming his phone onto the desk. "People are saying things, crazy things, about me online." His associate, a nervous-looking man in his 30s, glanced at the phone. The screen displayed a flurry of messages, many of them from angry former clients. I don't know, Daniel," he stammered. "It's everywhere. I didn't even know you were involved in this stuff." "I'm not," Daniel snapped. "It's lies. Someone's trying to smear me." But as the day wore on, Daniel couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. The emails, the financial records, the photos, they were too specific, too damning to dismiss as a smear campaign. He paced his apartment, his mind racing. He couldn't figure out who was behind it. He hadn't made any obvious enemies, or so he thought. Meanwhile, Liam watched from the shadows. Mason had arranged for a contact at a local news station to pick up the story, ensuring the exposure went beyond social media. That evening, a segment aired detailing the investigation into Daniel's fraudulent activities. The reporter outlined his schemes, complete with interviews from some of his past victims. Liam felt a pang of satisfaction as he watched the broadcast from his hotel room. This was justice in action. But Daniel wasn't going down without a fight. The following morning, Liam received a call from Emma. It was the first time she'd reached out since he had confronted her about the affair. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Liam," Emma's voice was shaky, filled with a mix of panic and anger. "What have you done?" Liam's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" "Daniel," she snapped. "He's saying someone's spreading lies about him, that someone's trying to ruin his life. He thinks it's you." Liam's lips curled into a grim smile. "They're not lies, Emma. Everything out there is the truth." "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "He's furious. He's saying he's going to sue whoever's behind this. He's talking about retaliation." "Let him try," Liam said coldly. "He won't get far." Emma's silence on the other end spoke volumes. For the first time she seemed unsure of herself, unsure of Daniel. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "Why can't you just let it go?" "Because he's a con artist," Liam said firmly. "And because you deserve to know who you've been trusting." As the days passed, Daniel's attempts to retaliate only made him look guiltier. He hired a lawyer, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Every move he made to defend himself was countered with another piece of damning proof from Liam and Mason. Liam sat in his hotel room watching the chaos unfold. He felt a strange mix of emotions, satisfaction, relief, and even a touch of sadness. He had set out to expose the truth and he had succeeded. But it had come at a cost. His marriage was in shambles, and the woman he had once loved was now part of a scandal that would follow her for years. One evening, Mason joined Liam for a drink at the hotel bar. They clinked glasses, the weight of their accomplishments settling in. "You did it," Mason said, his tone lighter than it had been in weeks. "He's done. His reputation is ruined, his connections are severed, and the authorities are on his trail." Liam nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey. "It's not just about him, though. It's about everyone he hurt." "And Emma?" Mason raised an eyebrow. "You thinking about giving her a second chance?" Liam shook his head. "No. She made her choices. But I hope this wakes her up. I hope she realizes the kind of man he really is." As the plan came to its final stages, Liam felt a sense of closure. Daniel's world was crumbling and the truth was finally out. But Liam knew this wasn't the end of his journey. He had faced betrayal and heartbreak, but he had also discovered a strength he didn't know he had. And as he looked toward the future, he knew he was ready to rebuild. Daniel Cross wasn't the type to back down. By now, his once perfectly manicured life was unraveling faster than he could patch it together. As Liam and Mason watched from the shadows, Daniel began lashing out in every direction, desperate to regain control. His calculated arrogance, the trait that had made him a master manipulator, was now his greatest weakness. It started with his public denials. Daniel issued a statement through his lawyer, claiming he was the victim of a malicious smear campaign. The press release was carefully worded, but the cracks in his facade were showing. His charm, which had fooled so many, was wearing thin in the face of overwhelming evidence. Liam sat in his hotel room, scrolling through the news coverage of Daniel's statement. He smirked as he read the comments. Public sympathy was nowhere to be found. Instead, former victims of Daniel's schemes were coming forward, sharing their own stories of financial ruin and emotional manipulation. "They're turning on him," Mason said, leaning back in his chair. "He can't control the narrative anymore." "Good," Liam replied. "Let him squirm." But Daniel wasn't done. The next move came swiftly, a legal notice delivered to Liam's hotel room. Mason grabbed the envelope before Liam could touch it, inspecting it carefully. "Defamation suit," Mason said, tossing it onto the table. "He's trying to scare you?" Liam opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the document. The accusations were laughable, filled with baseless claims and empty threats. "Does he really think this will work?" Liam asked, incredulous. "It's not about winning," Mason explained. "It's about making you second-guess yourself. He wants you to back off." Liam clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. "He's not going to intimidate me. Not now." "Good," Mason said with a grin. "Because this is where things get interesting." Over the next few days, Daniel ramped up his retaliation. He began planting stories in the media, painting himself as a victim of jealousy and revenge. One article described him as a successful entrepreneur under attack from baseless accusations. Another suggested Liam was a jilted husband seeking vengeance. Liam slammed his laptop shut, frustration bubbling over. "He's spinning lies faster than we can counter them." "Let him," Mason said calmly. "The more he talks, the more rope he gives us to hang him with." "But people believe him," Liam argued. "What if this ruins everything we've worked for?" "It won't," Mason assured him. "Because we have the truth on our side. And the truth always wins." One evening, Mason's phone buzzed with a new lead. He answered, his face lighting up as he listened to the caller. When he hung up, he turned to Liam with a triumphant smile. "That was Rachel," Mason said, referring to the forensic accountant they had hired. "She found something big." Rachel joined them at the hotel later that night, a folder of documents in hand. "Daniel's been using offshore accounts to hide his money," she explained. "And guess what? We found the transactions linking those accounts to Emma's transfers." Liam's heart sank at the mention of Emma. He had tried to push thoughts of her aside, but every piece of evidence seemed to pull her deeper into the web of lies. "So she's involved," he said quietly. Rachel shook her head. "Not necessarily. It's possible she doesn't know where the money is going. But that's for you to figure out." Mason leaned forward, his excitement palpable. "This is it, Liam. This is the nail in the coffin." Armed with the new evidence, Liam and Mason prepared for the next move. The goal was simple: force Daniel into a corner where his lies would unravel publicly. They planned a carefully orchestrated confrontation, one that would leave Daniel no room to escape. The opportunity came during a charity gala Daniel was attending. Posing as a guest, Mason managed to plant one of the incriminating documents in Daniel's possession. It was a copy of a financial transaction tying him to one of his shell companies. The idea was to rattle him, to make him slip up in a public setting. Liam watched from a discreet corner of the room as Daniel discovered the document. His face turned pale, his confident smile faltering for the first time. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the culprit. When he spotted Liam, his expression shifted from confusion to rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" Daniel demanded, storming across the room. Liam stood his ground, his voice steady. Exposing you? Daniel laughed, though the sound was hollow. You think you're untouchable? He sneered. You think you can ruin me? That's your biggest mistake, Liam shot back. Thinking you're untouchable? The exchange drew the attention of nearby guests, their whispers filling the room. Daniel's composure cracked further as Liam held up his phone, playing a recording of Daniel's incriminating conversation with the fake investor Mason had set up weeks earlier. Here's the thing, Daniel, Liam said, his voice carrying across the room. The truth has a funny way of coming out. And now everyone knows who you really are. The aftermath was chaotic. News outlets picked up the story within hours, broadcasting footage of the confrontation. Daniel's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. His remaining allies abandoned him, and his lawyers quietly withdrew from his case. But Daniel wasn't finished. In a final act of desperation, he confronted Liam outside the hotel one night. His eyes were wild, his voice shaking with rage. You think you've won? Daniel spat. This isn't over. Liam met his gaze, unflinching. It is for you. You'll regret this, Daniel snarled, stepping closer. Liam didn't back down. The only thing I regret is not exposing you sooner. Daniel's threats rang hollow as security escorted him away. Liam watched him go, a strange sense of calm washing over him. For the first time he felt like he had taken back control of his life. Back in his hotel room, Liam sat with Mason, reflecting on the journey so far. We're close, Mason said. He's out of moves. Liam nodded, his determination unwavering. Let's finish this. The final stage of the plan was in motion, and Liam was ready to see it through. The courtroom was packed, a sea of faces buzzing with anticipation. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras aimed and ready. Daniel Cross sat at the defendant's table, his suit immaculate, but his expression betrayed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Beside him, his lawyer whispered hurriedly, but Daniel's focus was fixed on the man across the room, Liam. Liam sat in the plaintiff's section, his posture confident but restrained. This was the moment he had been working toward, the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning and countless sleepless nights. Beside him, Mason leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. The air between them was thick with unspoken satisfaction. The judge entered and the courtroom fell silent. The case was called and the opening arguments began. Daniel's lawyer spoke first, painting his client as the victim of a vindictive smear campaign orchestrated by an angry, scorned husband. The words were carefully chosen, each one dripping with false empathy. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a smug smile tugging at his lips. Liam's lawyer rose next. Rachel, the forensic accountant who had become an integral part of the team, had provided every piece of damning evidence. Bank statements, recorded conversations, and even sworn testimonies from Daniel's previous victims were laid out in painstaking detail. Each point dismantled Daniel's defense, brick by brick. When Liam took the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. The lawyer approached him with a calm, measured demeanor. Mr. Hale, she began, can you describe the events that led to your discovery of Mr. Cross's fraudulent activities? Liam's voice was steady as he recounted everything. The anonymous text that had led him to the hotel, the discovery of Emma's betrayal, and the months of investigation that had followed. He spoke with precision, careful not to let emotion cloud his testimony. But when he described the impact Daniel's actions had on his life, his voice wavered just slightly. Mr. Cross didn't just manipulate my wife, Liam said, his gaze locked on Daniel. He manipulated me. He used our marriage, our trust, as a weapon. And I'm not the only one. He's been doing this for years. The defense lawyer attempted to discredit Liam's testimony, but each question was met with calm, factual answers. By the time Liam stepped down, the weight of his words hung heavy in the room. The turning point came when Rachel took the stand. With the precision of a surgeon, she laid out the financial web Daniel had spun. She showed the jury how he had funneled money from Emma into shell accounts, how those accounts were linked to fraudulent businesses, and how the same pattern appeared in case after case involving other victims. The final nail in the coffin was the recording Mason had secured during the fake investor meeting. As the audio played in the courtroom, Daniel's confident voice filled the air, detailing his scheme in his own words. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's face paled, and for the first time his mask slipped. Liam watched him closely, noting the subtle shift in his demeanor. The confidence was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. In his closing arguments, Liam's lawyer stood before the jury. "This case is about more than fraud," she said. "It's about justice. Mr. Cross built his success on lies, manipulation, and the suffering of others. It's time for him to face the consequences of his actions." When the jury left to deliberate, the tension in the room was suffocating. Liam sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. Mason leaned over, whispering, "Whatever happens, you did everything you could." Liam nodded, but his gaze never left Daniel. He wanted to see the moment the man realized he had lost. The jury returned quicker than anyone had anticipated. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before reading the verdict. "We find the defendant, Daniel Cross, guilty on all counts." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The reporters sprang into action, cameras flashing as murmurs filled the air. Daniel slumped in his chair, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Liam let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. Liam watched him go, a strange mix of emotions swirling within him. Satisfaction, relief, and even a touch of sadness. This man had destroyed so much, yet in the end he had destroyed himself. Mason clapped Liam on the back, pulling him from his thoughts. "You did it," he said with a grin. "He's done?" Liam nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. "This is only the beginning." The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. Daniel's assets were frozen, his reputation in tatters. Former victims began filing lawsuits, emboldened by Liam's success. The media continued to cover the story, turning Daniel into a cautionary tale. Emma reached out once, leaving a voicemail Liam didn't return. He wasn't ready to face her yet. Maybe he never would be. For now he was focused on rebuilding his life. Weeks later, Liam sat in a small cafe, the same one where he had first met Mason to discuss the plan. He sipped his coffee, a sense of peace settling over him. He had been through hell, but he had come out stronger. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined him. Mason slid into the seat across from him, a mischievous grin on his face. "You look almost relaxed," he said. Liam chuckled. "Almost?" They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Mason spoke again. "So what's next for you?" Liam shrugged, a smile tugging at his lips. "Whatever I want." And for the first time in a long time he meant it. Daniel Cross sat alone in his now empty office, the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the blinds. The once bustling space that had been filled with his assistants, lavish furnishings, and constant activity now felt cold and lifeless. His desk, once cluttered with documents of supposed business ventures, was bare. The silence pressed down on him, amplifying the whispers of his downfall. A television on the wall flickered with the evening news. Daniel had muted the sound, but the images were enough. His name scrolled across the bottom of the screen, paired with the words "fraud scandal" and "con artist exposed." Clips from the trial played in a loop, showing Liam's calm testimony, Rachel's expert analysis, and most damning of all, the recording of Daniel confessing his schemes during the fake investor meeting. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. The smug confidence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow expression. Everything he had built was gone. His money, his reputation, his freedom. The people he had fooled, charmed, and manipulated had turned their backs on him. Even Emma, his last remaining ally, had stopped returning his calls. He picked up the remote and unmuted the television just as a former victim's interview began. "He promised me the world," the woman said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But he left me with nothing. I lost my savings, my home, and my trust in people. I'm just glad someone finally stopped him." Daniel threw the remote across the room, the plastic cracking against the wall. The sound echoed in the emptiness, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. Meanwhile, Liam was finding a quiet satisfaction in seeing justice served. He stood outside his hotel balcony, watching the sunrise with a cup of coffee in hand. The trial had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but the verdict had given him a sense of closure. Daniel's schemes had been exposed to the world, and his victims had a chance to rebuild. But the scars of betrayal lingered. Liam thought of Emma often, of the life they had shared, the memories they had built, and the trust she had shattered. He hadn't returned her calls or listened to her voicemails. He didn't need to hear her excuses or apologies. He needed space to heal. Mason joined him on the balcony, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. "You look like a man who just got his life back," Mason said with a smirk. Liam chuckled softly. "It doesn't feel like it yet. But I think I'm getting there." "You did something most people wouldn't have had the guts to do," Mason said. "You took down a guy who thought he was untouchable. That's not nothing." Liam nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I just want to move on. I'm tired of living in the past." Daniel's downfall continued to escalate. His frozen accounts and mounting lawsuits left him with no resources to defend himself. The media hounded him relentlessly, turning him into a spectacle. Stories of his previous victims began resurfacing, each one painting a darker picture of his life as a con artist. His face was plastered on every news outlet, accompanied by headlines like "The Rise and Fall of a Fraud King" and "Daniel Cross," a name synonymous with deceit. But the most damning moment came when Emma, the woman he had seduced and manipulated, decided to speak publicly. In an exclusive interview, she recounted how Daniel had lured her in, preyed on her vulnerabilities, and used her love to further his schemes. "I thought he cared about me," Emma said, her voice breaking. "But he used me. And in the process, I hurt the person who actually loved me." Liam saw the interview while flipping through channels one evening. He paused, his jaw tightening as Emma's face filled the screen. For a moment he considered turning it off, but something compelled him to watch. "I let myself believe the lies," Emma continued. "And I betrayed someone who didn't deserve it. I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life." Liam turned off the television and sat in silence. Emma's words stirred a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of forgiveness. But he wasn't ready to confront those feelings. Not yet. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding for Liam. He returned to his work, pouring his energy into projects that had once brought him joy. He reconnected with old friends, rediscovering parts of himself he had forgotten during his marriage. Slowly but surely, the weight of betrayal began to lift. One afternoon, Liam received an email from Rachel. Attached was a letter from one of Daniel's former victims. The letter thanked Liam for his courage in exposing Daniel, calling him a hero for helping so many people find justice. Liam read the letter twice, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time in a long time he felt a sense of purpose. Daniel, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions alone. His appeals were denied and his prison sentence loomed. The people he had once charmed had moved on, leaving him to face the reality of his choices. He spent his days in solitude, haunted by the empire he had built on lies. In his cell, Daniel stared at the blank walls, his mind racing with thoughts of what could have been. The world had moved on without him, and he was left with nothing but regrets. One evening, Liam stood on a new balcony, this time overlooking a quiet beach. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was soothing, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past year. He had bought the small beachfront house as a symbol of his fresh start, a place where he could leave the past behind and focus on the future. Mason called, his voice cheerful as ever. "How's the beach life treating you?" Liam smiled. "Peaceful. Exactly what I needed." "Good to hear," Mason said. "You deserve it. After everything, you deserve some peace." As Liam hung up, he leaned against the railing, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in a long time he felt a sense of calm. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. He was ready to embrace whatever came next. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled Liam's ears as he stepped out onto the balcony of his new home. The early morning sunlight cast a golden glow over the ocean, and a gentle breeze carried the salty scent of the sea. This was his sanctuary, a small beachfront house he had purchased after leaving the chaos of the city behind. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. It was his. Liam closed his eyes and took a deep breath, savoring the peace that had eluded him for so long. The last year had been a whirlwind of emotions: betrayal, heartbreak, anger, and eventually healing. He had come a long way from the man who had discovered his wife's affair and uncovered Daniel's schemes. The wounds were still there, but they were no longer raw. Time and distance had softened them, turning pain into lessons and regrets into resolve. After the trial, Liam had thrown himself into rebuilding his life. He returned to his work, focusing on projects that reignited his passion. His company, which had suffered during the chaos, began to thrive under his renewed attention. Walking into his new office one morning, he felt something he hadn't in months: peace. The space was bright and modern, filled with possibilities. It wasn't just an office, it was a symbol of a fresh start. His team had been supportive throughout the ordeal, rallying behind him when the truth about Daniel came out. They had seen Liam at his lowest and stood by him as he picked himself back up. Their loyalty reminded him of the importance of genuine relationships, a stark contrast to the betrayal he had endured. One afternoon, Rachel visited him at the office. The forensic accountant who had been instrumental in exposing Daniel's fraud was now a trusted friend. She carried a bottle of champagne and a wide smile. "You've earned this," she said, setting the bottle on his desk. Liam chuckled. "I think we all did. I couldn't have done it without you and Mason." Rachel waved him off. "You're the one who had the courage to face it head-on. Most people would have crumbled." Liam leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "I almost did. But I realized something. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone Daniel hurt. And about proving to myself that I could get through it." Rachel raised her glass in an imaginary toast. "To redemption, then?" "To redemption," Liam echoed, clinking his glass against hers. Liam's personal life also began to heal. He reconnected with old friends, people he had drifted away from during his marriage. They welcomed him back with open arms, offering support and laughter when he needed it most. One of those friends was Ethan, his college roommate, who had always been the life of the party. Ethan had insisted on a weekend getaway to the mountains, a chance for Liam to unplug and unwind. Sitting around a campfire under a star-filled sky, Liam found himself laughing freely for the first time in what felt like years. The burden of the past no longer weighed him down. He was rediscovering who he was outside of his marriage, outside of the pain. As for love, Liam wasn't ready to dive back in just yet. But he wasn't closed off to the idea either. One evening, while walking along the beach, he struck up a conversation with a woman who was collecting seashells with her young daughter. Her name was Sophie, and there was something about her kind smile and easy laugh that put Liam at ease. They talked for hours, sharing stories about life, loss, and new beginnings. When they parted ways, Liam felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: hope. He didn't know if it would lead anywhere, but for now, it was enough to know that he was open to the possibility. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued its downward spiral. His attempts to appeal his conviction were denied, and his assets were liquidated to repay his victims. The media's interest in him had waned, leaving him to face his fate in obscurity. In prison, he was just another inmate, stripped of the charm and power that had once defined him. For Liam, knowing that Daniel was facing the consequences of his actions brought closure. But he didn't dwell on it. His focus was on the future, on building a life that was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he could create. One day, Liam sat on the beach with Mason, watching the waves roll in. Mason had come to visit, bringing his usual blend of sarcasm and wisdom. "You know," Mason said, skipping a stone across the water, "you're like one of those phoenixes in mythology. Rising from the ashes and all that." Liam laughed. "I don't know about that. I'm just trying to move forward." "And you're doing a damn good job of it," Mason said. "Not everyone gets a second chance. You've earned yours." Liam looked out at the horizon, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's not about second chances, Mason. It's about what you do with them." As the months turned into a year, Liam found himself thriving in ways he hadn't thought possible. He volunteered at local charities, using his experience to help others who had been betrayed or taken advantage of. He became a mentor to young entrepreneurs, sharing the lessons he had learned about resilience and integrity. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. They were reminders of how far he had come, of the strength he had discovered within himself. Liam had faced the worst and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined to live a life filled with purpose and joy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Liam stood on his balcony, a sense of peace washing over him. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm steady and soothing. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment: the betrayal, the pain, the fight for justice. It had been a long and difficult journey, but it had shaped him into the man he was now. As he watched the sky turn shades of orange and pink, Liam allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He had rebuilt his life from the ground up, not just for himself, but for the people who had believed in him, who had stood by him when he needed them most. He raised a glass of wine to the setting sun, a quiet toast to redemption, resilience, and the road ahead. Liam sat at his desk, a warm cup of coffee in his hands, as the soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the window. The newspaper on the table bore a headline he'd been waiting for: Daniel Cross sentenced. Con artist faces 15 years in prison. Below the headline was a grainy photo of Daniel being escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, his once confident smirk replaced with a defeated scowl. Liam read through the article, every detail confirming that the fight had been worth it. The sentencing had been swift, the evidence overwhelming. Victims from across the country had come forward, emboldened by Liam's case, to testify against Daniel. Their voices had been heard, their stories validated. Daniel's fraudulent empire had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his crimes. As Liam folded the newspaper and set it aside, he felt no pity. Betrayal had a price, and Daniel was finally paying it. In prison, Daniel's life was a far cry from the luxury he had once flaunted. Stripped of his suits and power, he was just another inmate. The guards treated him with indifference, and his fellow prisoners had no sympathy for a man who had preyed on others. His name, once synonymous with charm and success, was now a cautionary tale. Every time he heard his name mentioned on the news or read in letters from his former victims, it served as a reminder of his irreversible fall. Sitting alone in his small cell, Daniel often replayed the events that had led him here. He thought of Emma, whose silence had been deafening since his conviction. He thought of Liam, whose persistence had been his undoing. And he thought of himself, the choices he had made, the lives he had destroyed. For the first time in years, there was no one left to blame but himself. Liam, on the other hand, had found a sense of peace he never thought possible. The trial, the revelations, the confrontations, all of it had been a crucible that forged him into someone stronger. Yet, the scars remained, subtle reminders of the pain he had endured. One afternoon, Liam found himself walking through a park near his new office. The air was crisp, the laughter of children and the rustle of leaves filling the space around him. He paused at a bench and sat down, letting the moment wash over him. It was here, in the quiet simplicity of life, that he reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the lessons he had learned. Trust, once so freely given, now carried weight and value. He had learned the importance of resilience, of standing up even when the world seemed to crumble beneath him. Most importantly, he had learned to let go, not of the lessons but of the anger and bitterness that had threatened to consume him. Emma had reached out a few more times after Daniel's conviction. She had sent emails and left voicemails, her tone oscillating between apologies and explanations. But Liam hadn't responded. He had listened to one message just once, but the words had only deepened his resolve to move forward without her. Liam, her voice had cracked through the phone, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. For what I did to us. He had closed his eyes, the pain of her words cutting deep even after all this time. But forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about her, it was about him. And he wasn't ready to give it yet. Months later, Liam was invited to speak at a conference for victims of fraud. Rachel, who had become a close friend and confidant, had recommended him as a keynote speaker. Standing on the stage in front of hundreds of people, Liam shared his story, not as a victim but as someone who had reclaimed his life. "I thought my world had ended," he told the audience. "But what I learned is that even in the darkest moments, there's a way forward. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it's possible." The applause was thunderous and Liam felt a swell of pride. For the first time he saw himself not as someone defined by betrayal, but as someone who had risen above it. Meanwhile, Daniel's downfall continued to ripple outward. News outlets reported that his remaining assets had been seized and liquidated to pay restitution to his victims. His name had become synonymous with deceit, ensuring that even after his release, he would never escape the shadow of his crimes. Emma too had faced her own reckoning. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unable to reconcile the woman they knew with the choices she had made. She lived quietly now, her life a stark contrast to the one she had envisioned when she first fell for Daniel's charm. One evening, Liam sat on the balcony of his beachfront home, a glass of wine in hand. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment: the betrayal, the pain, the fight for justice. It had been a long and grueling journey, but it had shaped him in ways he never could have imagined. Mason had visited earlier that day, bringing his usual blend of humor and insight. "You know," he had said, lounging in a deck chair, "not many people get the chance to completely rebuild their lives." "You didn't just rebuild, you reinvented?" Liam had laughed, shaking his head. "It wasn't easy. Nothing worth having ever is," Mason had replied. "But look at you now. You're proof that you can come back stronger." As the waves crashed against the shore, Liam allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The scars of his past were still there, but they no longer defined him. They were reminders of his strength, of his ability to overcome even the most devastating of circumstances. A notification buzzed on his phone. It was an email from a young entrepreneur he had been mentoring, thanking him for his guidance. Liam smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. He had turned his pain into purpose, and in doing so, he had found himself again. He raised his glass to the horizon, a quiet toast to resilience, justice, and the future. The past was behind him, and for the first time, the road ahead was filled with possibility. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and purple. Liam stood on the balcony of his beachfront home, his hands resting on the railing as the ocean breeze ruffled his hair. Below, the waves crashed against the shore in a steady rhythm, a soothing reminder of the constancy of nature. He took a deep breath, letting the salt-laden air fill his lungs. For the first time in years he felt free from the weight of betrayal, the anger, and the pain that had consumed him for so long. This house, with its warm wooden floors and expansive windows overlooking the sea, was a manifestation of his new life. It wasn't just a physical space, it was a symbol of his fresh start, a place where he could rebuild himself without the shadows of the past looming over him. Liam's days were now filled with purpose. His company, which he had nearly abandoned during the darkest days of his journey, was thriving under his renewed leadership. The office had become a vibrant hub of creativity and collaboration, a reflection of the passion Liam had rediscovered. Employees who had once feared for the company's future now looked to him with admiration and respect. Walking into his office one crisp morning, Liam paused to take it all in. The hum of activity, the smiles of his team, the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the corner, it was a far cry from the tension that had once hung over this space. He felt a sense of pride, not just in the business he had built, but in the resilience that had brought him here. "Boss," his assistant called, handing him a stack of documents. "The quarterly numbers are in." "Another record-breaking month." Liam grinned, flipping through the reports. "Good work, everyone. Let's keep it going." As he settled into his desk, a framed photo on the corner caught his eye. It was of him and Mason, taken at a charity event they had attended a few months back. The memory brought a smile to his face. Mason had been his anchor during the storm, a friend who had stood by him when he had felt most alone. Their bond, forged in adversity, had only grown stronger. Liam's evenings, once filled with restless pacing and sleepless nights, were now calm and fulfilling. He had found joy in simple pleasures: reading on the porch, long walks along the beach, and reconnecting with hobbies he had once abandoned. Painting, a passion he had neglected for years, became a regular part of his routine. His small studio overlooked the water, and the gentle sound of waves often found its way onto his canvases. One evening as he worked on a new piece, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Sophie, the woman he had met on the beach months earlier. They had kept in touch, their conversations growing deeper with each passing week. Sophie's warmth and genuine nature had been a breath of fresh air, a stark contrast to the deceit he had endured. The email was short but heartfelt. "Dinner this weekend? I'd love to hear about your latest painting." Liam smiled, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. He tapped out a quick reply, "Looking forward to it. See you Saturday." The weekend dinner with Sophie was simple yet perfect. They sat at a small table on her patio, the warm glow of lanterns casting soft light over their meal. Her daughter, a lively and curious 6-year-old, joined them for dessert, her laughter filling the air. As Liam walked home under the stars, he realized something that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And for the first time he was open to the possibility of love, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as something entirely new. In the background, Daniel's name continued to fade from the public's consciousness. His imprisonment, though once headline news, had become just another story. His once flawless reputation was irreparably tarnished, and the victims he had wronged were beginning to rebuild their lives with the restitution they had received. Emma, too, had retreated into obscurity. Liam had heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to a smaller town, seeking anonymity and a fresh start. Though he hadn't spoken to her since the trial, he wished her no ill will. She had made her choices and so had he. Their paths had diverged and he had no intention of looking back. One afternoon, Liam received an invitation to speak at a local university. The topic: resilience in the face of adversity. Standing before a lecture hall filled with eager students, he shared his story, not as a tale of heartbreak, but as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. "I learned that life doesn't always go the way you plan," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But it's not about what happens to you, it's about how you respond. You can let it break you or you can let it shape you into someone stronger." The applause that followed was thunderous, but it wasn't the sound of clapping that stayed with Liam. It was the faces in the audience, the nods of understanding, the glimmers of hope, that reminded him why he had fought so hard to reclaim his life. That evening, Liam returned to his balcony, a glass of wine in hand. The sun was setting, the sky painted in vivid streaks of orange and purple. As he gazed out at the horizon, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road to this moment had been long and arduous, but it had led him to a place of peace. The scars of his past were still there, faint reminders of where he had been. But they no longer defined him. Instead, they were badges of honor, proof of his resilience and his ability to rise above even the darkest of times. He raised his glass to the horizon, a quiet toast to the life he had rebuilt, the lessons he had learned, and the possibilities that lay ahead. Standing on the balcony of his new home, Liam smiled. The past was behind him and the future was his to claim.